The moment Joe Rogan said it out loud, the internet stopped breathing. Not because the words were loud, not because he slammed a fist on the desk or stormed off camera or posted some furious tirade at 3 in the morning. That's not how Joe Rogan operates. That has never been how Joe Rogan operates. What made the moment so devastating, what made it travel from his studio in Austin to every corner of the internet within hours, was the quietness of it. The way he leaned forward, looked at the documents spread across his desk, let the silence stretch just long enough, and then said it in that flat, unvarnished tone that 15 years of loyal listeners had learned to read like a second language. Something doesn't add up. 5 words, no drama, no performance, and yet those 5 words from that particular man, sitting behind that particular microphone, hit the political landscape of America like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples are still moving. To understand why, you have to understand what Joe Rogan actually is. Not what his critics say he is. Not what his defenders claim. What he actually is. Joe Rogan is not a conservative commentator. He is not a liberal activist. He is not a party mouthpiece dressed up in a podcast format. He is something rarer and, in the current media environment, something considerably more dangerous to whoever he turns his attention toward. He is the most listened to independent voice in America. 50 million people tune in every week. 50 million. More than any cable news network. More than any newspaper, more than most television channels combined. And the reason those 50 million people keep coming back, the reason they trust him in a way they no longer trust almost any other media figure, is precisely because he has never pretended to be anything other than a man sitting behind a microphone saying what he actually thinks. He endorsed Donald Trump. Not officially, not with a campaign donation, but in the way that matters more in this era. With 3 hours of his time, his platform, and his visible credibility, his audience watched that interview. They listened to him give Trump room to speak. They watched him nod, push back occasionally, and ultimately signal to 50 million people that this was a man worth their attention and their vote. Political analysts argued afterward about how much the Rogan interview moved the needle. The numbers suggested it moved it considerably. So when that man, that specific man, with that specific history, with that specific audience, sat down behind his microphone and looked at the Epstein files and said something doesn't add up, it wasn't a political attack. It wasn't opposition research packaged as opinion. It was something far more significant. It was genuine confusion. And genuine confusion from Joe Rogan is worth more to the American political conversation than 1,000 coordinated attack ads, because the people who need to hear it most trust his confusion infinitely more than they trust any network's certainty. The studio was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that settles into a recording space when the topic shifts from something easy to something that doesn't have an easy answer. Rogan sat with his elbows resting on the desk, his expression carrying that particular weight he gets when he's working through something in real time, rather than performing a position he arrived with. The documents were there. The redactions were visible. The timeline was sitting right in front of him, and the more he turned it over, the less it made sense. "Like, what is this?" he said, his voice low. "This is not good. None of this is good for this administration. It looks terrible. It looks terrible for Trump." He wasn't shouting. He wasn't performing outrage for an audience hungry for red meat. He was doing what he always does, processing out loud, letting the audience follow his thinking in real time, trusting them to arrive at the same place he was arriving at through the same honest route. And the place he was arriving at was uncomfortable, because the story he was telling himself, the one he had told his audience, the one that had framed his endorsement and shaped his coverage, that story was starting to develop cracks. Here is what those cracks looked like from the outside. In February of 2025, the Trump administration made a promise to America: full transparency on the Epstein files, no more redactions, no more cover. The great unveiling, the thing the deep state had allegedly been hiding for decades, the thing that QAnon forums and late-night Twitter had been demanding with increasing desperation for years. Trump framed it personally. His allies amplified it. His base celebrated with the specific kind of euphoric relief that comes when a years-long conviction is finally about to be validated. For one brief, electric moment, the political spectrum collapsed. People who agreed on nothing else agreed on this. The files were coming out, and the truth was finally going to be visible to everyone. Then the files arrived, and the names were still redacted. Not the names of the victims, not the names of the children who had suffered. The other names, the powerful names, the names that people had spent years insisting were buried in those documents. The names that the entire mythology around the Epstein case had promised would finally, definitively, shatter something at the highest levels of power. Those names remained invisible behind thick black bars, and simultaneously, in what felt to many observers like a grotesque inversion, some of the victims' names, the people the entire exercise was supposedly designed to protect, appeared unredacted, exposed, left visible in documents that were released to the public. Joe Rogan noticed. He didn't immediately post about it. He didn't fire off a reaction. He sat with it. He turned it over. He let it settle into whatever internal mechanism processes information for a man who has spent 15 years training himself to distinguish between what he knows and what he's been told. And then, when the mic was live and the moment came, he said it plainly. If you got redacted people's names and these people aren't victims, what are you doing? The question hung in the air of his studio. Simple, direct, impossible to dismiss as partisan or ideological. Just a man looking at a set of facts and asking the obvious question that the facts demanded. But he didn't stop there. He reached for a word that carried considerably more weight than confusion. A word with specific meaning and specific implications. He looked at what the Trump administration had done with those files. The selective exposure, the maintained redactions, the gap between what had been promised and what had been delivered. And he called it what he saw it as. That's the gaslightiest gaslighting I've ever heard in my life. The audience in the studio went still. In that particular way, audiences go still when they hear something they weren't expecting. Gaslighting. That word deserves to sit there for a moment because Rogan chose it deliberately, and its implications are not subtle. Gaslighting is not incompetence. It is not bureaucratic delay. It is not the chaotic stumbling of an administration that bit off more than it could process. Gaslighting is a deliberate, calculated attempt to make people doubt the evidence of their own eyes. It requires intent. It requires a sustained effort to replace reality with a preferred version of events. Joe Rogan, a man who had sat across from Trump's FBI director Kash Patel on his own show, a man who had helped legitimize the very people now running the Justice Department, a man whose endorsement energy had contributed meaningfully to putting this administration in power, looked at what those people had done with the Epstein files and concluded that they were running a deliberate operation designed to make the public believe it wasn't seeing what it was obviously seeing. That accusation from that source was not a small thing, and his audience heard it differently than they would have heard the same words from any other direction. A liberal commentator making that argument would have been dismissed before the second sentence. A Democratic politician would have been filtered out through layers of existing distrust. But this was Rogan. This was the man they had followed into this political territory in the first place. When he said the word gaslighting, they didn't reach for the remote. They leaned in, because his confusion wasn't being performed for a political purpose. It was the real thing. And real confusion from a trusted voice hits differently than manufactured outrage from a political opponent. The numbers that emerged in the weeks following told their own story. A YouGov survey of Americans on the Epstein files produced a result that should have stopped every political strategist in Washington cold. 52% of the American public, more than half the country, believed that the Trump administration was actively working to cover up Epstein's crimes. 22 percentage points more Americans believed there was a cover-up happening than believed there wasn't. That gap, 22 points, is not a fringe position. That is not a marginal opinion held by people on the edges. That is the American mainstream. That is the center of the country's political opinion expressing a conclusion about the sitting president's relationship to one of the most toxic scandals in recent history. But the detail that made the number truly remarkable, the detail that explained why Rogan's reaction mattered as much as it did, was the demographic breakdown of who was following the story most closely. The Epstein file obsession did not begin on the left. It was born on the right. It was cultivated in MAGA forums and QAnon communities. It was the theory of people who believed deeply that a massive elite network had been protected for years by the very establishment that Trump was running against. The voters who showed up in 2024 carrying that belief, who pulled the lever partly because they were convinced Trump would be the one to finally open the vault, were the same voters who were now watching Democrats track the Epstein story more closely than Republicans. The people who built the fire were walking quietly away from it because the smoke had started blowing in a direction nobody had anticipated. And somewhere in that demographic shift, in that quiet repositioning, Joe Rogan's words were doing their quiet, steady work. Then came the moment that revealed something else entirely. Something about the nature of the information environment around this story and the tools available to those who wanted to manage it. Trump was asked about Barack Obama and a comment involving the word alien. His response wasn't a denial. It wasn't clarification. It was something far stranger and far more strategically telling. He said, almost conversationally, that he might declassify the UFO files, that it might help get Obama out of trouble, that this was something he was considering. Sit with that for a moment. The President of the United States, in the same news cycle where Epstein file redactions were dominating every podcast, every newsroom, every political conversation happening at dinner tables and in break rooms and on commutes across America, chose that moment to introduce the possibility of UFO declassification into the news stream, not as a random aside, not as an afterthought, as a pivot, as a redirect, as a new, shiny, mysterious thread for the media's attention to follow rather than the uncomfortable, close-to-home thread it had been pulling on. Rogan noticed the pattern. He didn't state it in those exact terms on camera. He didn't deliver a structured analysis of narrative management and news cycle manipulation. That's not his style. But his response said everything that needed to be said. He laughed first, a short, reflexive laugh that carried a note of recognition. Then he went quiet. Then he moved on. That movement, that specific tiny arc from laughter to silence to subject change, communicated to his audience in a language they have spent 15 years learning to read. It said, I see it. You should see it too. I'm not going to tell you what to think about it, but I see it. When you control the information, you also control the distraction. A well-timed announcement about alien files does not just generate its own headlines. It actively replaces the headlines that were dominating the conversation before it arrived. It gives the news cycle somewhere new to go. It gives audiences something mysterious and exciting to chase rather than something uncomfortable and concrete to confront. The mechanics of it are not new. The application of it in this specific context, against this specific backdrop, was visible enough that a man like Rogan registered it without needing to be told. And 50 million people registered that he registered it. That is the position Joe Rogan now occupies in this story, and it is a position unlike any other voice in the American media landscape currently holds. There is a version of this that makes him the most significant accountability voice in the country right now, not because of ideology, not because of any partisan commitment, but because of geography, because of where he sits in the political and cultural map. He was inside the coalition. He had the access. He helped build the trust. The people who most need to hear a serious, sustained, honest examination of what actually happened with those files are not the people who are already convinced. They already believe it. They've already made up their minds. The people who matter in this moment are the Republicans, the Libertarians, the Independents, the listeners who turned off CNN years ago and decided that a man in a studio in Austin with no network affiliation and no political handlers was the closest thing to an honest information source they had found. Those people will hear a liberal commentator accuse the Trump administration of covering up Epstein and dismiss it before the sentence is finished. They have trained themselves to hear that kind of claim as political noise. The filter goes up instantly and nothing gets through. But they will sit with Joe Rogan's silence for a week. They will replay his tone. They will think about the specific word he chose, gaslighting, and they will turn it over the way he turned over those documents, and the conclusion they arrive at will feel like their own conclusion rather than something handed to them by a source they've already decided not to trust. That's what makes it matter. That's what makes it different from every other voice currently making the same argument from a different place on the map. The question that hung over the story, the question that sat behind every Rogan clip, every redacted document, every poll number and demographic shift, was not whether the truth about those files mattered. That question had already been answered. It mattered to the majority of the American public. It mattered across party lines. It mattered in ways that were measurable and real and moving in a direction that no amount of UFO declassification news was likely to fully redirect. The question was simpler and harder at the same time. In whatever quiet moment existed between recording sessions, between fight commentary and guest scheduling and the constant churn of a 50 million listener operation, Joe Rogan knew exactly what position he occupied in this story. He knew his silence said something. He knew his tone said something. He knew that the most politically powerful thing he had ever done might not be the endorsement he gave in 2024, but the confusion he expressed in 2025, sitting behind his microphone, looking at documents that didn't add up, and saying so in plain language to the audience that trusted him most. The stage lights of the Ed Sullivan Theater had gone dark weeks earlier. The cameras at Colbert's desk had stopped rolling. The viral clips had moved through their cycles. But in Austin, in a studio that looked nothing like a television set and operated on entirely different rules, a different kind of reckoning was playing out on a longer, slower, more consequential timeline. Joe Rogan sat behind his microphone. The documents were still there. The redactions were still there. And 50 million people were still listening, waiting to hear whether the man who had told them to trust this administration would tell them, clearly and without the cushion of ambiguity, what he actually thought was happening with those files. The silence between his words had already said more than most people were willing to say out loud. The only question left was whether the words themselves would eventually catch up. Follow for the stories nobody else is covering straight. And if you believe accountability shouldn't stop at party lines, share this before the algorithm decides you shouldn't see it.